Okay. Um, so for people who don't know who I am, my name is Chris Newman. I am a farmer of very little consequence. But the important thing is my background is in technology. I was a software engineer for about 10 years before the career path kind of burned me out. You're going to hear a lot of like dogs, kids, and just like all kinds of ratchet stuff going on out here. So I was a software engineer by trade for about 10 years before I got burned out of that career. And for the longest time, my wife and I thought that we were going to do raising of indigenous meats as kind of a retirement project. I'm an enrolled member of the Choptico Band of Piscataway Indians, so I'm biracial, Black and Native, and I have a lot of my farming ethics, especially today, are informed by by my background as an indigenous person. But so what I'm going to talk about today, and this concept of democracy, especially indigenous democracy in food and agriculture that I talk about a lot, kind of confuses people. They don't really know what it means. It sounds like a kind of wishy-washy kind of consulting term. So I'm going to bore all of y'all to tears with a little bit of history lesson. A question I get a lot is exactly when did the food system kind of really get screwed up? And I think that's something we can all recognize, that things are not the way they should be. We've got a food system now that is fundamentally based on subsidized commodities that are then processed by an agribusiness entity that sits on top of agriculture and spins the products from here into profit up here. And creates tens of thousands of SKUs based on corn and soybeans, and largely produces animal feeds. And we produce so much of the damn stuff that we're just developing products out of thin air for it, stuff that nobody wants, stuff like ethanol, stuff like, I don't know, ethanol is just the big one. I'll get in some trouble if I say things like plant-based meats or whatever, but that's part of what you're looking at. Like, you've got the food system and agribusiness and people that are creating food products basically just making money off of extracting commodities out of the land and mining soil, mining water, poisoning groundwater, things like that. And the question is, how did we get there? And when you read most of the conventional literature about food, they talk about a lot of the what, but they never really discuss the why. We talk about things like crop insurance, subsidies, minimum payments. We talk about check-off programs and like this weird kind of agricultural unions that exist. We talk about monocultures and GMOs and herbicides and BT corn and Roundup and all that stuff. But it's almost like the idea that we've got a continent devoted to growing corn and growing soybeans and growing just a handful of commodities that the federal government subsidizes. It's almost taken for granted. And we never really discuss how exactly the hell do we get here? And why are we in a system that's dominated by white people, dominated by a very specific type of white person, by which I mean wealthy, high net worth, even if they have low income. Most farmers do have above average income, no matter how much they whine about it. White farmers, that is, especially the grain guys and the cattle people. How do we wind up with a system where you have agricultural conferences where every single face is white? The kind of thing that's happening here, where you've got people of color just talking in a row, is a thing that does not happen very often. So the question is, how do we get here? And lots of people, excuse me, I have a very dry throat. A lot of people like to place it in different places. Well, a lot of people will say maybe it started with Earl Butz and the fact that agriculture was kind of subsumed into the military industrial complex in order to kind of stick it to the Soviet Union and say, hey, look how bountiful our grocery stores are. Or they'll roll it back a little further and say, well, maybe it's the Green Revolution, when munitions had to be redirected into agricultural fertilizer, and we started with chemical agriculture, and that was kind of laid the footprint for genetic modification as we know it today. Maybe it's there. A lot of people go back a little bit further, maybe to the turn of the 20th century, the 1920s, 1930s, where mechanization really started to take off in agriculture. You wind up with things like the Dust Bowl, because now with all our machines, we're really able to fuck up a lot of soil. And I am going to curse a lot. I'm sorry. That's just how I am. I'm a cattle guy. But when you fundamentally look at it, like where we got into this path is where America effectively declared war on Black people and on indigenous people in this country right around that period, at the end of the Civil War, and maybe about a decade or two leading up to it. So I'm going to talk about what happened with African Americans on the soil, especially right in the aftermath of emancipation. And I want to talk about exactly how the United States came to occupy an entire freaking half of a continent in the space of like 20 years, because that's incredible. Like, you know, that's like a biblical plague almost, like that speed and that just completeness. So the thing about us Black people is, at the end of the Civil War, we had all of the agricultural knowledge. We knew everything. Even before 1619, we had been accumulating agricultural knowledge for centuries, because we were the ones who were planting the fields. We were the ones who were harvesting. You talk about, like, you know, the Gullah Geechee people down south and in the low country in those areas, they basically invented the rice industry down there. White folks did not invent that, and we were not just hard labor. We were the brains behind that stuff. Black people were the ones who mastered cultivating tobacco at scale, rice at scale, millet at scale, sorghum at scale, cotton at scale. Like, all of these things were held kind of in the hive mind of the enslaved population in the United States prior to emancipation. In addition to cash crops that were grown mostly to enrich white people, we were also good at market gardening. We were growing the fruits and vegetables that went to the big house, that went to our cabins, and that we traded with our neighbors at different plantations in order to be able to live and subsist as best we could. And the thing that really gets missed is that, and what I really wish was talked about more in history classes about farming, is that when you've got an enslaved population, you know, you imagine you get your ass up before friggin' like 5 a.m. Like right now, I'm in Virginia, and it's light enough to work at like 4:59 a.m. So, you know, overseer is putting you out in the field at 4:59, you know, in June or July. You go out there, you farm until it's too dark to work. And then somehow, you know, you farm tobacco. Around here, you're probably farming tobacco. You go a little further south, you're farming cotton. If you're really unfortunate, you're on the rice plantations or the sugarcane plantations way down south, where life is just really specifically terrible. You do that all day long. And then somehow, in between all that, you're working 13 straight days, usually with 1 day off after that. And somehow you're managing to produce enough market vegetables, things, you know, fruits and vegetables, the stuff that we find at the farmers markets today. You're able to produce enough of that to feed yourselves, your families, you know, several slave communities around you, and the big house. Somebody that can do that is the best goddamn farmer on the planet. I cannot explain how good you have to be at farming to be able to grow food and grow cash crops under those conditions and still kick ass at it. So what happens at the end of the Civil War is white people are shitting their pants with fear, because all of a sudden you've got this entire group of millions of Black people who are recently emancipated and hold all of the agricultural knowledge. White people don't have it. At this point, you've got plantation owners who've been handed through succession, through intergenerational inheritances. They've been handed their slaves, they've been handed their land, they've been handed everything. They don't know how to plant anything. You know, the last white guy on some plantation, some large plantation, maybe in Central Virginia, the last person that knew anything about horticulture or agronomy or anything like that probably died right after the American Revolution. These guys are people that are born with silver spoons in their mouths and are just leaning on Black bodies to get to make their fortunes and to get themselves fed. So, you know, you're a plantation owner with a couple thousand acres, and all of a sudden your whole enslaved population is free. And then you've got people like Lincoln and Sherman and all these military generals promising things like 40 acres or maybe 15 acres or steel farming implements and draft animals. You're going to be scared to death, because what that poises Black people to do is take over agriculture forever. All right, if you wind up with real reparations at that point in the form of land, and you've got all the knowledge, then you've got everything you need. You're not relying on white people at all. You know, you can forge your own destiny at that point. And the United States would engage in a century long campaign to make sure that that did not happen. That the best farmers in the world, and I will argue with anybody about this, that at the end of the Civil War, nobody was a better farmer than a Black person, than especially an emancipated slave in the South. That you couldn't find a better farmer anywhere on the planet. Not for like market crops, not for row crop, not for cash crop. You know, fight me. they systematically made sure that African Americans were not able to take over agriculture because that's where wealth was at the time, and they weren't having it. Meanwhile, a decade or so before this, what white people were really arguing about in the lead up to the Civil War. Hi, Xander, how you doing? This is one of my, well, I'm gonna embarrass her right quick. How you doing? Say hi to all the lovely people. I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna waste everybody's time. That's one of our farmers, black farmers representation, very important in agriculture. So in the lead up to the Civil War, white people were basically arguing about, okay, how exactly do we invade the American West? Like, that was the big question. It wasn't really about the morality of slavery. It wasn't about, do black people deserve to be free? It was really about northern white people saying, hey, it's not really fair that all these white people down south who own these plantations and have all this wealth and have all this money are going to gobble up all that land out west and make themselves even wealthier. And you had southern plantation owners who were really looking toward the West as a way to perpetuate the institution of slavery, because it was starting to die, not only because of mechanization, not only because it was becoming an issue globally where most other countries had outlawed it, but you know, it was just dying. They were running out of land to farm. They needed new places to invade. They just needed new land. And if you're a white slave owner, you're looking out west and thinking that's an awful lot of land that needs to be cultivated. That creates an awful lot of demand for slaves. And demand for slaves makes you wealthy as a southern plantation owner. You don't even actually have to cultivate things. It's just the demand. If I got 100 slaves and suddenly everybody out west needs all these people to cultivate that land out there, and slavery is legal, then guess what? You're sitting on a gold mine made out of people. It's disgusting, but that's the way the economy in the 19th century worked. That's what we're looking at. So anyhow, what winds up happening is, of course, the South succeeds. The North gets what it wants, which is that they're not going to send slaves out there. They're going to make this a thing where people who don't have slaves can build their fortunes out there on land that is already occupied by the ancestors of people who are near and dear to me today. So the question then becomes, though, again, from the perspective of a white person, if you're looking out west, it's not exactly a pretty sight out there. It's gross. Like, how do you invade and occupy an entire half of a continent that is, it's biblical out there, dude. Like, you're white, you're looking out there, there's Indians out there, there's grizzly bears, wolves, lightning, fire, floods. The sod is like a foot thick and like breaks iron implements in the middle of it. Like, it sucks out there. It's like I don't know, it's a nightmare for people who are used to the temperate East, where they've got established plantations, they've got established cities, and effectively an established civilization. Nobody wants to go the hell out there. So the question becomes, all right, who are we going to send out here to occupy all this land so we can make manifest destiny actually happen? And the answer to that question is poor ass white people. So if you look at maps of, like, you can go on Google and you can look at ethnic maps of white people in the United States, and you see in the East, it's a lot of Anglo people, Irish people, et cetera. But you look out into like flyover country, where the Homestead Act allotted all these places for people to go out there, it's almost all Germans. It's all these poor ass immigrants that they sent out there basically as pawns. If you look at the term pioneer is derived from Old English and French words that mean foot soldier and pawn. They're expendable. We like to think that, you know, the Homestead Act was this uniquely progressive thing because, dude, anybody could homestead. You didn't have to be a citizen. You could be anybody. You could be a recent immigrant. You could be free black. You could be a single woman. And that's framed as progressivism, but what that really is, that is a list of people that the United States of America didn't give a single shit about and were willing to send out there into a buzzsaw so that they could start playing this little game of chess to see, okay, where are the Comanche, where are the Apache, where are the Sioux, where are the Dakota, where are the Nakota, where are the Cheyenne, like where are all these people, how strong are they, like what's going to happen, how do we start wars so that we can deal with these people? And if you look at it like a game of chess, that's exactly what they were doing. I mean, you could just see some like mustache twirling like white politician back in 1860 or whatever, saying, you know, looking at a chessboard and saying, okay, we're going to send this pawn here, see if they move their pieces after it, see what they're doing, and then once they're exposed, we're going to send in our knights. We send in the U.S. cavalry. When they expose themselves over here, we're going to send in our bishops. We're going to send in residential schools. We're going to force these Indians to be Christians. And that's how the American West was basically occupied. And what happens is, after you send all these poor ass white people out there, most of them fail. You know, they get chewed up in the meat grinder that they knew it was. They get absolutely obliterated. 80% of them fail. You know, a lot of them wind up moving back east. A lot of them die. You know, they wind up in conflicts with Native people. They freeze to death. They starve to death. They get eaten by wolves and freaking grizzly bears. Like, it's crazy out there. But the ones that manage to survive start consolidating the quarters from their neighbors that don't make it. These farms start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we think about agriculture back in the 19th century, and like there's all this nostalgia around farming only really got screwed up and really got commodified and globalized like recently, you know, after the Earl Butz era, or maybe after the Green Revolution. But no, agriculture in America has always been about global trade. Ever since they started bringing black people over here to grow sugarcane, to grow tobacco, to grow cotton, you know, stuff you don't, you know, you eat sugar, of course, but this was all about sending products somewhere where there was a market and making people rich. And that didn't magically stop in the 19th century. That absolutely continued as the invasion of the American West proceeded. So you've got farms that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is happening like 1870, 1880. Railroads come in, you start seeing things like grain elevators. You know, we're made to think that silos and grain elevators and you know, the Chicago Board of Trade being involved in commodity trade is all like this relatively like post-depression kind of thing. No, it was happening during the invasion of the American West. Railroads brought grain elevators with them. This was absolutely about a global trade, a national trade. Some corn, you know, was turned into corn flour and sent south and gave a bunch of white people and black people and Indians pellagra and all that stuff because they milled the germ out of it. So nixtamalization didn't work. Something that anybody could have told me who'd ever talked to an Indian, but we were in residential schools at that point. And it was a lot of it is, you know, it's so reminiscent of agriculture today. We have this nostalgia about, you know, it was okay then, but it's not okay now. But back then, they were growing grains on these increasingly large homesteads in order to feed livestock, in order to ship the stuff overseas. You know, corn is great. It lasts forever. It's fungible. It transports easy. It's easy to store. It's not all that bulky. It's always been a trade of corn, and it's always been exploited. So this is kind of the situation that you get, like, you know, when mechanization comes along, like, you know, during kind of before the Depression era, and especially after World War II, fertilizers come in, GMOs come in, you know, the Earl Butz plant fence row kind of thing comes in. All that is just a logical extension of what started at the end of the Civil War, when Europeans decided that they were going to make a fortune out of the American West and start mining the soil and mining the water out there. That was always the idea. And what's interesting about all of that is, whereas you have African Americans who are really good, at cash crop, and really good at market gardening, really good at taking care of soil in order to grow food that people actually want to eat. Whereas they're good at that and doing that like at an intensive scale, Native people created these vast food producing ecosystems that were so big and were so unlike what anybody thought of as a farm, that when white people started going west, and even when white people hit the east and started like getting into the woodlands and wondering why the understory was on fire and how the trees were spaced so far apart that you could ride a carriage through it at gallop, they did not realize that they were on a giant farm that had been deliberately cultivated. You know, the plains in the American West, the tall grass prairie, was not an accident. That is not a wild state. Native people were setting fires. They were deliberately running herds of bison from one place to the next. They were using, they were leveraging other predators to do it, which is why Native Americans didn't go around killing every wolf they could, because wolves are useful for moving herds. Those tall grass prairies, you know, you hear people like Alan Savory or Joel Salad and anybody talking about bite effect and how bite effect builds soil and all this other stuff. This is not stuff that white people invented. This is stuff Native people saw happening and took advantage of it. You had an indigenous agricultural ethic where Indian sees tall grass prairie, Indian sees the dance that's done by wolf and bison and pronghorn and says, okay, how do we maximize this? How do we get there to be as many bison as possible so that it's always providing for us? You know, it's like we move like water with the contours of the natural environment, whereas that white ethic that came out west said, nah, I can't commodify a wild animal. So let's go ahead and take our plows and bust the hell out of this sod. And then 200 years later, you go from having, you know, several yards or whatever of topsoil under the American tallgrass prairie to having like nothing, to having a freaking dust bowl. That's what happens when you ignore indigenous, excuse me, when you ignore indigenous land stewardship ethics. You have a catastrophe. It's not about fairness. Like when we start talking about, you know, what democracy actually means, and the idea that every system has a vote and like the best ones win. When you don't do that, this ain't just about being fair to Black people or being fair to Indians. This is about, if you pick the wrong food production system, you're going to destroy the planet. And that's what's happening. This ain't wah, it's unfair. You know, this is how we live on this planet for the rest of our lives. And the thing is, when you got three, let's call it three groups of people. This is an oversimplification. Let's call it three. You got one group of people who have centuries of agricultural knowledge about growing crops sustainably for an eating market, as well as growing cash crops. You got another group that creates these giant ecosystem level food systems that are so big that you don't even realize you're standing in the middle of them. All right. That have just existed for centuries and centuries and are very deliberately managed on an extensive scale. And then you got a third group of people who are able to grow grains and beans, animal feed, and livestock, but they can't do it without destroying the planet in the process. And it's just real damn odd that it's that third group that somehow is dominating the agricultural conversation. It's that third group that has control of the most land. If there were any democracy or any merit involved in any of this, we'd all be telling them to sit their asses down so that Black people and indigenous people could unfuck what they've done for the last several centuries. Okay? So what winds up happening is you have a discussion of how exactly do you restore Black people and indigenous people and our farming ethics to the agricultural system, given all that's happened. And it becomes a tough thing, because I know, in my own experience, I'm not going to talk for everybody, but in my own experience, a lot of people are really in love with the whole ethic of small farming, farming oriented around nuclear families, the whole small family farm, Jeffersonian kind of ethic. That has really captured the imagination across the board. As white people, Black people, a lot of Latino people, indigenous people, like a lot of us, including me, fell prey to that notion that this is the way agriculture should be. It should be these little teeny tiny farms that are like these closed ecological loops, and they're all run by their own entrepreneurs, and they're oriented around a nuclear family and good old fashioned wholesome American bullshit. Turns out it doesn't really work that way. It's a model that doesn't work well. There's a reason it hasn't really proliferated, and there's a reason that the models of agriculture that have worked here have involved, for example, large groups of Black people working the land as collectives, and has involved indigenous people who don't even believe in the concept of land ownership at all and view it as a commons that is everyone's responsibility. So the question is, how do you get that ethic back into farming and kind of distance yourself maybe from the small farming ethic? Because what I found out the hard way when I started farming with this idea that it was going to be me and my wife and my kids and maybe a couple farmhands, and we were going to grow all this corn and shit or whatever we got back here and a few chickens or whatever. Getting access to land, getting access to training, and all the things that people of color have such a difficult time getting a hold of. What we don't realize is that once you've got all those things, if you're lucky enough to get them, the fun's just freaking starting, yo. Like, it's almost like if you're going to run a marathon, you got to get in your car, you got to drive to the race site, you got to get out of your car, you got to put like tape over your nipples or whatever it is marathon runners do. I can't stand running. And then you got to run the freaking marathon. Once you have land, once you have training, and once you have a business plan and an idea of what you want to do, all you've done is driven your car to the race site. Like, now it gets crazy. Now you got to figure out how exactly you're going to sell your stuff. You've got to deal with racism at farmers markets. You got to deal with racism in restaurants and in the food service industry, where it is just terrible. When you are by yourself, when you're an entrepreneur and trying to navigate all the hurdles that come with entrepreneurship, there are very few people that are cut out to be entrepreneurs. It's just too damn hard and it takes a very specific type of personality to succeed at it, you go into that, you're looking for an ass kicking, and you're going to get it. So I watched like all these permaculture design courses and a lot of gurus who talk a lot about that first part, about getting your car to the right site, getting access to land, getting training, figuring out how to like get people to help you on the farm, how to like get hooked up with wolf so you can take advantage of slave labor your own damn self or whatever the heck wolf is all about. And you just look at it and it's like, this isn't going to work. You know, there's maybe 1% of people that try this that are going to be successful after maybe 10 or 15 years, especially if they're the specific type of farmer that wants to farm for a living and only farm, and not like, it's a hell of a beast to try to make a living from doing nothing but farming and not relying on grants or injections of money from the government or from nonprofits or foundations or whatever. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's telling that a lot of farms that do succeed rely on those, and it like there's just not enough of that kind of systemic money available for everybody. So what we're doing over at Sylvanaqua Farms, now that I've beaten my head against that wall of like being that independent entrepreneurial businessman type farmer, is, look, I'm going straight on like friggin' anarchist and going back to my indigenous roots, which is combining the ethics that you see from a lot of Latinx and African American farmers who are very good at growing, you know, row crop and market gardens and things that are grown sustainably in a good way, in a way that builds soil and creates ecosystem services and does what needs to be done for the landscape, while also responding to the market, which, you know, again, grain and like traditional tractor farming that the two young ladies talked about before, that's dumbass farming. That's actually correct. That's the correct assumption. If you see a guy on a tractor all day, yeah, I ain't gonna say it out loud, but and then combining that with an indigenous ethic where you are farming collectively, where you're farming at a very large scale, a scale that's so large that you don't realize you're on a farm, where you're combining things like what I've got behind me is a Three Sisters garden, and, you know, behind that is a forest that's full of pawpaw and persimmon and wild forages and morels and mushrooms and all these other things, and actively maintaining those at a large scale, creating an ecosystem, a whole entire ecosystem that produces food, so that you're able to have a positive ecological impact on an entire watershed or an entire like kind of microbiome, and not just operating like on a couple acres or 3 or 4 acres. Again, this is not to like crap all over small farming. Like, there's a whole lot of good to be done in things like truck farming and homesteading and farming part-time and urban gardening and vertical farming and hydroponics and all that. Those things are all fantastic, and they need to be part of the future of food, especially in close-in areas where African Americans don't have access to the type of land that we've kind of stumbled into kind of by accident. But for me, and in our case, we have stumbled into a huge amount of land. We are on we're on a plantation that is the birthplace of Robert E. Lee, of all people. And because of white guilt, we basically get all that land. It's like 1,900 acres. We've got access to pretty much all of it for free. So we wanted to create a system where, you know, African Americans, queer folk, indigenous people, Latinx people who want to express themselves on the landscape but don't want to deal with taxes, regulations, you know, developing markets, knocking your head up against, you know, farmers markets doors every single week to try to get into the high value ones where you can actually make a living. You know, people of color and people who have this agricultural tradition deserve to be able to make a living on the land, just growing food, just growing the food that people actually want to eat, and not just growing commodities that go into some nameless, faceless commodity market endpoint. So our goal is to, instead of me being the head of the thing and I'm the owner and I've got my farmers or whatever that work for me, I'm giving up ownership. Because, you know, given the price of food, what people are willing to pay, what people have been conditioned to value food at, you just can't over the long term pay people what they deserve. Agricultural work is skilled work. It is not dumbass work. You know, a lot of really well-intentioned people email me all the time, can I please come and help you process chickens? I'm like, no, dude, you're going to be in the way and you're probably going to get hurt. You know, it's work that deserves like $15, $20 an hour. And if you can't pay it, which You know, I've done the math 6 weeks from Sunday, you freaking can't. So what do? You give people ownership, because you can build a hell of an asset base being a farmer. You know, between owning land, between high value livestock, things like cattle, you can wind up where people are making, you know, maybe like a minimum wage kind of thing, but in the background, over the course of like 6 to 7 years, they're developing enough wealth to retire on once they decide to cash out. I had I think maybe my 3rd year of farming or so, I had a landlady who was just rich as all hell. She had like 1,700 something acres, like right outside of Charlottesville. And whenever she needed a couple $100,000 for whatever, she had a cattle herd that she didn't even manage. It was managed by a farm manager. She had something like 300-400 head of cattle. Whenever she needed a bunch of money, she just sent some cattle to the sale barn and just came home with like a freaking like bag of money with a dollar sign on it. It was crazy. So there are ways to pay people equitably, working at scale, as long as you're willing to kind of subsume yourself as a farm owner, which is what I'm trying to do, and, you know, share ownership, make it collective. That was the strength of indigenous landholding. Like, you know, the reason that the Allotment Act happened with like the Dawes Act and all that other shit was because white people came in and saw like the little bit of like good land that we still had in the reservation system. They were like, man, I want some of that. But Jesus, like in order to get it, in order to get them to sell it to me, I got to convince like 150 freaking people to sell it to me, because it was collective. It was owned that way. So, you know, what did Joe White Guy do? Joe White Guy passes the freaking Allotment Act and says, okay, we're going to break up, you know, we're going to break up this reservation, and each family is going to get its own little piece. And then one by one, y'all being these rugged individuals or whatever, are going to get picked off one at a time, one at a time, one at a time. Heirs property works the exact same friggin' way. Like as soon as we start separating people and not operating together, where we are really in this, not just me and my friggin' employees, but all of us together sharing the same fate, we have no power, none. We're screwed. And that is like the biggest thing that we have got to unfuck about agriculture, especially when we're talking about restoring whole ecosystems and you know, going beyond food sovereignty, because food sovereignty, I think that's where it starts. But beyond that, Black people, indigenous people, we have absolutely got to get our hands on more land. It has to be managed by us, because I'm telling y'all, we're the only ones who give a shit. We're the only ones who have that intergenerational knowledge that knows actually how to restore these places properly. We're the only ones that can stop thinking about things in terms of global markets and commodities and just scaling up individual products instead of scaling up our land management ethics and things like that. It is really up to us. So I'm not going to ramble on too much longer, because honestly, I actually did not prepare this talk. I'm just running my mouth. But I will say that there's a much more coherent version of what I'm talking about in an essay that I've written called Food and Empire. If you haven't read it, I highly suggest that you do. It talks about what America's original farming sins really are, which is basically the fact that we stole too much land, and America's food system is a result of 2 centuries spent justifying stealing more land than we needed to, and killing more people than were necessary, and enslaving an entire continent of people. And the other thing is, if you want to learn more about our cooperative and how we're kind of transitioning away from the traditional farming model to a more indigenous focused system where everybody's an owner, where we operate on thousands of acres, where we're doing extensive agriculture, and we're blending intensive market-oriented agriculture with agroforestry and extensive like food forests and things that have been co-opted under the permaculture movement, which I could also talk for hours about. You can read all that on our website. We are taking donations for our phase one raise to get our first bit of owned land together. And that is all I have to say about that. Does anyone have any questions? Oh wait, I'm supposed to look at the chat or something. I've been awake for a very long time. I'm sorry. Let me see. Audience question: how do you envision agroforestry, food forest playing into food sovereignty? And any recommendations on the indigenous? Any recommendations on the indigenous agroforestry practices that we can use for guidance? Yeah, that's a big one. So in the food sovereignty movement, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of talk about culturally appropriate diets and restoring diets that are not only nutritious but that are culturally relevant. And I think agroforestry has a lot to do, especially with that intersection with food sovereignty. One of the biggest things that's led to poor health, especially among indigenous people, has been our removal from our traditional diets. Native people would be removed from their traditional homelands, and they'd be forced onto a reservation, forced onto a farm. And it's interesting where the parallels are between, African Americans being forced to farm and us having this cultural aversion to the idea of farming because it's slavery. For Native people, there's a parallel where farming is almost like a form of surrender. Our equivalent term for Uncle Tom is hanging around the Fort Indian, and that's somebody who would seek safety, from white people by being with white people and adopting their ways, including intensive farming, the way that they farm. Native people get removed to the reservation system. All of a sudden, the things that we're relying on, wild foods, wild stocks, in addition to, depending on what part of the dividing line between nomadic hunting cultures and more agricultural cultures, depending on which side of that line you're on, you're trading for various things. You're trading for meat, you're trading for corn, you're trading for hominy and things like that. That was removed, and your ass is on the reservation, and now you've got pork and sugar and flour, and next thing you know, yada yada, and there's like 80% diabetes on certain reservations today in the United States. So blending agroforestry and being able to reestablish game trails, organized hunts, deliberate management of wild stocks, restoration of things like wild pawpaw and persimmon and the various native flora that are in this area are very much a part of undoing what was a very deliberate attempt to basically just poison us with food that was alien to us. And any recommendations on? There's a book called Food Sovereignty, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States that I could recommend reading, but honestly, there's a whole lot of racism in the publishing world, and you're not going to find like a lot of easily available resources on this. People ask me all the time, like, can you recommend this book, that book, that book? I'm like, dude, I can't, because they're not there. You got to know people. You got to actually, you got to go find some Indians and follow them on their social media and get them to trust you, because we tend not to want to give up a whole lot sometimes for pretty obvious reasons. So it's a lot of work. To get that knowledge, but it's worth trying to get. Question 2: how do you go? What happened there? How do you go about lobbying landowners to become aware of concepts like shared ownership and getting them to justify transfer access to land fairly? So you have to become your own landowner. When we're talking about shared ownership, it's almost like, so the way our cooperative is going to work is we're going to have a combination of owned land and leased land. The idea is that ultimately we have like 1,000 acres that we own, and we have maybe 5,000 acres that we manage extensively. And whoever is an Ihapkahet or a land protector in that system owns a piece, like an equal piece of whatever it is that the collective owns. So if we own that 1,000 acres, then whoever's Ihapkahet owns a part of that 1,000 acres. You don't necessarily have to convince somebody who's a landowner that you're leasing from to get down with that model. All they care about is their land either being taken care of, or in a lot of cases getting property tax breaks and things like that. But yeah, it's one of those things where it's like the simple solution is to own land, but that's why it's so important, I think, for us to really combine our efforts and maybe leverage some of the successes that people who are really lucky, like I am, have had, because I know that, maybe 1% of what I've done is because of hard work, and the other 99% is just me forest gumping my way into thousands of acres of land and the living that I've managed to make. Like, I am not that smart. I'm just lucky. So it's my responsibility, at least in this area, to share that with everybody else. But in terms of convincing people to get down with the concept of shared ownership, I don't see that being too much of a practical obstacle, really. Can you share any more about how that shared ownership model works? Yeah, it's basically like a law firm. If you've got you got a law firm and you've got partners in the law firm, then they all share in the profits, they all share in the assets. You know, they like everybody's an owner. It's not like one person at the top owns everything and everybody else is just an employee. It operates like a law firm. You know, the idea is that you would come here, you work for a while, you figure out what your place is in the landscape, and you decide what you want to do. You might want to becoming a livestock person. You might want to becoming a plantsman, a food forest type person, an orchardist. You might really like bees. You might decide to make food out of insects. You might be a really good hunter. You might be a really good forager. Who knows? But the idea is that you spend some time figuring out which part of the contours of the land you fit in. And then once you do, and once it's clear that you know, it's a fit and that you want to be there and that the community, you know, accepts you, it works exactly the way Indian societies did. You know, you're in for a while and then you're a part of it, and then you own it, and you're a legal owner. You're a legal owner of whatever assets and whatever profitability that we're able to get out of the system. You know, after we feed our communities and take care of the ecology and do what we're supposed to do. I think that's it. Are there any more? I'm probably out of time.
Hey, what's going on, man?
What's good? I think I'm losing you. Anybody else can hear me?
You hear me?
Yeah, it's raining here, so I think I might be losing my signal.
Hello? Right now, as you can see in the background, power just got. So yeah, I'm hoping for something. But the question I had was,
oh man, I'm not hearing you.
Work with.
Well, I can't hear Matt, and I don't know if anyone can hear me, but I mean, my final thoughts are that just this. There he is. You all right, man?
Man, I'm sorry, y'all. Good Lord. Like, I tried to stop running in the rain. I had to run, go get my chickens put up. A thunderstorm just rolled in up out of nowhere. You know how that goes. And so I apologize to everybody, because that's that farm life.
I heard that, bro.
I don't know if you heard my only one question that I had.
No.
That one question was, and I'm not sure whether you covered it, because I was listening so much, and then I ran out to go do this chicken thing, was how does someone connect with you to come and help, like come out there to Virginia to help during, let's say, whether it be a harvesting time or planting time. And if you are open to that kind of, and I know with COVID-19, we're always going to be cautious, but I'm saying, like, how does someone connect with you to do those kinds of things? Because 1,000 acres is a lot of land. And and even if, you know, like you said, like, you know, people we want to volunteer, but don't really have the skill set to actually even volunteer, nevertheless farm. So yeah, tell us.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you're a person of color who's really looking to express themselves on the land and like learn what this life is all about, I'm more than open to teaching you. I ain't going to charge you. Like, it's, if you can get yourself here, just hit me up on email, chris@sylvanaqua.com, or hit me on Instagram. We'll figure out a way to make it work. I mean, with COVID out here, it sucks. And with our housing situation, we're just full of people right now. But that's part of the reason why we're going after this land, and why we're trying to build this Ihakahet village and get, you know, like 10 to 15 housing units built, so that we can have, like, you know, 30 people on the landscape at a time, and have space open for people to come in and hang out for like a week or a month or whatever, and be trained up. So yeah, if you want to be a part of that, yeah, just email me and we'll figure something out. It might not be immediate, but we'll get it together.
Well, consider me to be coming there. I love putting in work at other people's place. Plus, I'm able to learn things because the farm has institutional knowledge.
I need you to teach me, man.
Well, we'll get it together then. How about that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I really appreciate your time today, too, my friend. Never expected to catch up this way, you know what I'm saying? But I'm glad that we're able to see each other live. We're able to holler at each other live. Yeah, if you had one statement that you wanted to put out there as a pin in it for today, what would that be?
Black and indigenous farmers are going to save this world if it can be saved.
Ashe on that one. Well, peace and blessings. Safe travels.
Yeah, thanks. I think I got cows out somewhere, so I'm gonna have an interesting night.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to, like I said, us catching up at some point. Take care of your family and be safe.
I will, man. Wanishi to everyone. Thank you.
Wanishi.